Welcome to Marple's POV, but ones who do. Hello lovely listeners, and welcome back to Marple's POV. Whether you've been with us since the very beginning, or you're joining us for the first time today, we are so glad you're here. Do let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We always love to know. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask you something to carry with you as you listen. How well can you truly know a person you've called a friend for 30 years? And is it possible that friendship itself can become the perfect hiding place for a lie? Think on that. Now, if you haven't already, do consider subscribing so you never miss a new mystery. And with that, Chapter 1. The fire died, so did our friendship. A Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Grange in October. The drive to Thornfield Grange wound through 2 miles of beech woodland before it surrendered, rather reluctantly, to a sweep of gravel forecourt and the grey stone face of the house itself. October had stripped the beeches nearly bare, and their pale branches rattled against one another in a wind that carried the first serious promise of winter. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the back of Dorothea Fenn's ancient Wolseley, watched the trees with the mild, attentive expression she often wore in company, the expression that many people, to their later cost, mistook for vacancy. "You'll adore Cecily," said Dorothea, for approximately the 4th time since chipping heron. She was a stout, cheerful woman of 62, with white hair set in determined waves, and a conviction that enthusiasm, if repeated sufficiently, became persuasion. She throws the most marvelous weekends. Garden society business. Nominally, there's always a lecture and a walk round the grounds, but really it's just a gathering of old friends. You'll fit in beautifully. Miss Marple smiled. "You're very kind to bring me, Dorothea. Fresh air will do me good, and I'm sure the gardens are splendid, even at this time of year. Cecily keeps them immaculate. She has an absolute gift. You know she took over the Grange after her husband died. That's nearly 12 years ago now, and she's run everything herself. The garden society, the local fete committee, the church flower rota. She's the sort of person a village organizes itself around." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I know the type rather well." The Wolseley crunched to a stop. A young man in a wax jacket came round from the side of the house to take their bags, and Dorothea bounced out of the car with the energy of someone 20 years her junior. Miss Marple descended more carefully, pausing on the gravel to take in the facade of the house. Late Victorian, solid, confident, the windows large enough to admit plenty of light, but hung with curtains thick enough to exclude plenty of scrutiny. The front door opened before they reached it. Cecily Holt was a woman of 60, tall and finely made, with silver hair drawn up, and cheekbones that had evidently been considerable in her youth, and remained impressive in her age. She wore a dark green cardigan and a string of garnets, and moved with the particular ease of a woman long accustomed to her own territory. "Dorothea." She embraced her friend warmly. "And you must be Miss Marple. Dorothea speaks of you constantly and affectionately. Do come in. The others are already in the drawing room, and I've had a fire laid." The drawing room was long and pleasantly shabby, in the way of houses that have been genuinely lived in, rather than periodically redecorated. A fire of good size burned in the stone fireplace. 3 people were already arranged about it in attitudes of comfort fractionally too deliberate to be entirely natural. "My oldest friends in the world," said Cecily, with a gesture that encompassed all 3 at once. Marjorie Keel, a spare, precise woman of 58, who rose to shake hands with a grip that suggested she considered handshakes a form of assessment. Rupert Selby, a large, florid man of 60-something, who remained in his armchair and lifted his glass in greeting, and Rupert's wife, Pamela. Pamela Selby was perhaps 40, with the slightly over-managed appearance of a woman who had learned early that her looks were an instrument and had never quite put them down. She smiled at Miss Marple with warmth that was technically flawless. "And that," Cecily nodded toward a small writing table in the corner, where a young woman sat with a notepad, "is Nora Blythe, who keeps me organized, and without whom the Garden Society would collapse entirely." Nora Blythe looked up. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired, with quiet eyes, and the careful posture of someone who has trained herself to take up as little space as possible. "How do you do?" she said, and returned her gaze to her notepad. Dr. Fleming arrived as the tea things were being brought in, a lean, sardonic man of 65, an old friend of the Selby family, he explained, though he looked at Cecily when he said it. He had the manner of a man who found most social occasions faintly absurd, but attended them anyway, which Miss Marple thought was often a form of loneliness, masquerading as superiority. Tea was pleasant. The conversation moved through the comfortable channels of long acquaintance, shared memories, gentle complaints about the state of the roads, agreement that October had been damp. Miss Marple drank her tea and listened, which was what she preferred to do in unfamiliar company. She noticed several things. She noticed that Marjorie Keel watched Cecily with an attention that went slightly beyond fond regard, a scrutiny rather, that occasionally hardened at the edges. She noticed that Rupert Selby's joviality had the quality of a well-rehearsed performance, and that when Cecily mentioned anything financial, the cost of the new greenhouse, the Garden Society's grant application, his jovial expression tightened by a degree. She noticed that Pamela Selby touched her husband's arm at regular intervals with the habit of a woman who had once felt insecure and had developed the gesture before the insecurity passed, if indeed it had. And she noticed that Nora Blythe, who had been invited to join them for tea, sat slightly outside the circle of chairs, held her cup as though she might need to put it down quickly, and did not once initiate a remark. None of this was alarming. Old friendships carried sediment. That was simply the nature of them. The fire crackled agreeably. Outside, the wind had picked up, shaking the last leaves from the beeches. Cecily refilled cups and laughed at something Rupert said, and looked, Miss Marple thought, entirely at home and entirely composed, with only one exception. When she passed the plate of sandwiches to Dr. Fleming, her hand paused for just a moment, and something crossed her face that was not quite an expression, more the shadow of one, and was gone before it had properly arrived. After tea, Cecily showed Miss Marple to her room herself, a kindness that also, Miss Marple suspected, served some other small purpose. "I hope you'll be comfortable," Cecily said, setting the key on the dressing table. "The room gets cold at night. The heating in this wing is unreliable, I'm afraid, but there are extra blankets in the ottoman." "I'm very hardy," said Miss Marple. Cecily laughed, a genuine laugh, warmer than her public manner. "Dorothea said you were. She also said you were sharp as a new pin, which I took as high praise, coming from Dorothea." She paused at the door. "I'm glad you came, Miss Marple. It's a good thing, I think, to have someone present who doesn't already have a view of one." It was an odd thing to say. Miss Marple filed it carefully. Dinner that evening was excellent, a roast, properly done, with a claret that Rupert approved of at length. The conversation grew easier as the wine was consumed, and by the time they retired to the drawing-room for coffee, the group had acquired the loosened warmth of people who had known one another long enough to be careless, which was, Miss Marple had always thought, both the greatest pleasure and the greatest danger of old friendship. The fire burned well. At 10:30, Cecily rose to put another log on. "I'll say good night," she said. "I'm up early, the garden, you know, before breakfast." She smiled round the room. "Sleep well, all of you." "Good night, Cecily," said Marjorie, and her voice held something that might, under analysis, have been almost tender. Cecily went upstairs. Miss Marple, watching the fire, noticed that it was burning particularly cleanly, the wood dry, the draught good. She commented on it to no one in particular, and Dr. Fleming, who was the nearest, said, "Cecily always keeps a fine fire. It's one of her gifts." He said it with an inflection Miss Marple could not immediately categorize. She went to bed at 11, read 2 pages of her book, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the beeches. She was woken at 6:43 by a scream. Chapter 2. The Cold Hearth. The scream came from below, a single sharp sound that stopped as abruptly as it began, which Miss Marple had always considered more alarming than the sustained variety. She was out of bed and into her dressing gown with a speed that would have surprised people who assumed age moved slowly, and she was in the corridor within a minute, where she found Dorothea emerging from the adjacent room in a state of agitated undress. "What on earth?" "Downstairs," said Miss Marple, and led the way. Nora Blythe was at the foot of the stairs, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other gripping the newel post. She was still in yesterday's clothes, which struck Miss Marple immediately as worth noting. She was looking through the open drawing-room door. Miss Marple went in. The fire had gone out in the night. The grate was cold, grey ash settled flat, the remnants of the last log charred and spent. The room had the chilly, dead quality of a space from which all warmth has been withdrawn. In the armchair nearest the hearth, in the position a person might occupy if they had sat down to watch the dying fire, sat Cecily Holt. She was quite dead. Her posture was almost peaceful, upright in the chair, hands in her lap, head slightly tilted as if she had simply stopped mid-thought. There was a cup on the small table beside her, and a book, face down, and in the cold morning air of the room there was a faint smell that Miss Marple identified, after a moment's quiet consideration, as bitter almonds. She did not touch anything. She stood very still and looked for a count of 30, cataloguing everything she could see, and then she turned to Nora, who had appeared in the doorway. "Have you telephoned for a doctor?" Miss Marple asked. "Aye," Nora swallowed. "Dr. Fleming is here. A police doctor, I mean, and the police themselves. It needs to be done immediately." Nora stared at her, but she might have simply— "No," said Miss Marple, quite gently. "I don't think she's simply anything. Please telephone now." Nora went. Dorothea arrived, looked into the room, made a sound of distress, and had the good instinct not to enter. Rupert Selby appeared on the stairs in a silk dressing gown, assessed the situation with surprising speed and said, "God," in a tone that seemed genuinely shocked. Pamela, behind him, said nothing, but pressed herself against the wall of the staircase, in the manner of a woman who found it useful to have solid things at her back. Marjorie Keel came last. She walked past all of them into the drawing-room before Miss Marple could prevent it, stood looking at Cecily for a very long moment, and then walked out again with the rigid bearing of someone holding themselves together through will alone. Her face was the colour of old plaster. "She was alive at 10:30, Marjorie said, to the general air. "She said good night. We all heard her." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "we did." Dr. Fleming, when he arrived downstairs, was brisk and professional. He examined Cecily without touching the cup, and confirmed what Miss Marple already knew. Death had occurred several hours ago, during the night. When he straightened up and turned to the room, his expression was careful, in a way that professional composure did not entirely account for. "She had a heart condition," he said. "I've been her GP for 8 years. It's possible." "There is a smell in this room, Dr. Fleming," said Miss Marple, from her position near the window. "I am an old woman from a village, and I do not pretend to any medical expertise. But I spent a considerable part of last evening seated next to a chemist at a dinner some years ago, and he was very informative about certain compounds. I wonder whether you noticed the smell as well." Dr. Fleming looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but a form of careful, measuring attention. "The police will determine cause of death," he said. "Quite so," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I only mentioned it. The police arrived at 8. Inspector Crane was a compact, unhurried Cornishman of 45, who had the useful quality of appearing to take everything as it came, which meant people frequently told him more than they intended. He secured the drawing room, made arrangements for Cecily's body, and by 9 o'clock had established the house guests in the dining room with tea and the implicit understanding that no one was going anywhere. Miss Marple sat in the corner with her knitting, which she had fetched from upstairs, and which gave her the appearance of being pleasantly occupied and the reality of being precisely where she wished to be. The group assembled around the long dining table had the quality of people who share a secret without necessarily sharing the same secret. That is to say, each of them was concealing something, and the concealments were not identical. Miss Marple had noticed this phenomenon before. It was remarkably common in rooms containing a fresh death. Rupert was talking too much, which was probably habitual but had intensified. Pamela had gone quite quiet, which suggested that her habitual performance of warmth required energy she was currently directing elsewhere. Marjorie had not cried, which was interesting given how much she had evidently loved Cecily. Dr. Fleming drank his tea with mechanical regularity, like a man whose hands needed something to do. Dorothea was genuinely distressed, which Miss Marple found both touching and useful, as genuinely distressed people often said truthful things without realizing it. And Nora Blythe sat apart again, as she had at tea the previous evening, but the notepad was nowhere in evidence, and she was watching the door with the expression of someone who expects bad news and has been expecting it for some time. The fire in the dining room grate, a different fire, newly lit by the housekeeper, crackled and shifted. Miss Marple looked at the cold grey ash on Nora's left shoe. She had been in the drawing room before anyone else, which she'd explained by saying she'd gone to lay the morning fire and found Cecily there, and began to knit and to think. Chapter 3. Inspector Crane's Questions. Inspector Crane conducted his interviews in Cecily's study, a small book-lined room that smelled of dried flowers and old correspondence. Miss Marple, by dint of being the last on his list, and the person who had most clearly identified herself as a witness to something specific, she had mentioned the smell of bitter almonds to the young constable who took initial statements, waited in the corridor on a hard chair and knitted, and listened to what she could hear through the study door, which was more than Inspector Crane probably intended. Rupert Selby was expansive. He had retired to bed at 11, he said, his wife would confirm it, and had heard nothing until the morning. He and Cecily had been friends for 35 years, a terrible business. He could not imagine who would wish to harm her. He said this last sentence with a fluency that suggested it had not required much imagination to produce. Pamela Selby was brief. She confirmed Rupert's account, said she had taken a sleeping tablet, and had nothing further to add. Her voice through the door was even and uninflected. Marjorie Keel was in the study for longer than the others. Her voice rose once, sharply. "I want to know who did this," and then settled back into inaudibility. When she emerged, she did not look at Miss Marple. Dr. Fleming was measured and professional. He described Cecily's cardiac history in appropriate detail. He had last seen her professionally 3 weeks ago. Her condition had been stable. When Inspector Crane's voice asked something Miss Marple could not quite hear, Dr. Fleming's answer contained a pause, perhaps 2 beats too long, and then was perfectly composed. Nora Blythe wept during her interview, quietly and steadily, in the manner of someone who had been holding it back and had run out of capacity. When Miss Marple's turn came, she sat down across from Inspector Crane and his sergeant, with the air of a pleasant elderly lady who was very glad to be of any assistance whatsoever. "You mentioned a smell, Miss Marple," said Inspector Crane. "I did. Bitter almonds. It's associated with certain compounds, prussic acid derivatives most commonly. I may, of course, be entirely mistaken. I'm an old woman with no scientific training, but I thought it should be mentioned." "Quite right." Inspector Crane studied her with the gaze of a man who had learned to distinguish between helpful elderly witnesses and troublesome ones, and was not yet certain of his category. "Did you observe anything else during the evening that seemed unusual to you?" Miss Marple considered this with apparent care. "I observed a great many things, Inspector. Whether they are unusual very much depends on what the usual is, which I don't yet know well enough to judge. I had only just met these people." She paused. "I will say that the household gave me the impression, and this is simply a personal impression, worth very little, of a gathering in which a great deal was being carefully not said. But then, that's true of most gatherings of old friends." Inspector Crane looked at her steadily. "If you notice anything specific, Miss Marple, I will tell you immediately," she said. "I am not a person who believes in keeping things to oneself when lives may be at stake." She folded her hands in her lap. "I wonder, Inspector, what can you tell me about the terms of Mrs. Holt's will? I ask, only because financial matters are so often at the root of these things, and it would help me to know whether my impressions are leading me in any productive direction." Inspector Crane blinked. "We'll be looking into that, of course." She rose. "One other small thing. Nora Blythe's shoes, when she came downstairs, had ash on the left heel. Fresh ash, not the ash one collects crossing a garden path, the kind that comes from a cold fireplace grate." She smiled. "Good morning, Inspector." She returned to the dining room, where Dorothea immediately seized her arm and demanded to know what she had said and whether it had been helpful, and Miss Marple said, "I expect so, dear," and asked for more tea. Across the room, Nora Blythe looked up and met her eyes, with an expression that Miss Marple could now identify precisely. It was the expression of someone who has just realized they have been seen. Chapter 4. What the photograph said after luncheon. A subdued affair, the cook having apparently decided that an abundance of food was the appropriate response to tragedy, and produced soup, a fish course, cold meats, and an apple charlotte. The guests were released from the dining room, on the understanding that they would remain within the house and grounds. Rupert announced his intention of taking a short walk. Pamela went upstairs. Marjorie shut herself in the sitting room with a book she did not read. Dr. Fleming made a telephone call from the hall. Miss Marple, passing through, caught only the words, "rather sooner than expected," and "I can't discuss it here," and then stood by the hall window, looking out at the garden with his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Marple, with the placid purposefulness of a woman who merely wanted to acquaint herself with the house, explored. Thornfield Grange was the kind of house that told stories through its surfaces. The carpets were good, but old. The furniture had been chosen with taste and not replaced when it wore. The pictures on the walls of the staircase were a record of occupancy. Landscapes, a few portraits and photographs, framed and hung with the same deliberateness as the oils, which was not, Miss Marple thought, usual, and suggested that Cecily Holt had valued her history of the photographic kind. She stopped on the first-floor landing. There were 6 photographs arranged in a vertical row, in chronological order. She could track the progression of fashion, the changes in the faces. The earliest was taken outdoors, in summer, and showed 4 young women in their 20s, laughing at something outside the frame. Miss Marple identified Cecily immediately. She had the same bones at 25 that she'd had at 60, and Dorothea beside her, rounder and more vivid than she was now. Marjorie was there, thinner in youth, with an expression of compressed amusement, and a 4th woman, slightly apart from the others, dark-haired, with an uncertain smile. The second photograph, a few years later, the same 4 women, plus Rupert, younger, slimmer, more handsome, and Dr. Fleming, who had apparently barely changed in 40 years. Still that lean, observant face. The third, the same group, but the dark-haired woman was absent. No explanation. She simply wasn't there anymore, and the gap in the group had been closed, as groups always close, so that her absence was barely visible, unless you'd been looking for it. The remaining 3 photographs did not include her. Miss Marple looked at the dark-haired young woman for a long moment. Then she went along the corridor to the room she had identified as Cecily's private sitting room, a small, feminine space adjoining the main bedroom, its door ajar, and, with the liberty she permitted herself only in serious circumstances, went in. The desk held an appointment diary, letters, the ordinary correspondence of an organized life. She did not read the letters. She looked at the photographs on the desk, a different set, more personal. Cecily with a spaniel. Cecily with a woman who might have been her mother. Cecily with the dark-haired young woman from the staircase photographs. This one taken in close-up, both of them laughing. The image intimate in a way the group photographs were not. On the back of this photograph, in pencil, C and E, Whitstable, 1971. E, not in the later photographs. Not mentioned by Dorothea, who had named every other face in the group's history. Miss Marple set the photograph down carefully and noticed beside the desk a small wastepaper basket. In it, among the ordinary detritus of correspondence, was a torn envelope. She did not remove it. She looked at the postmark. 3 days ago. The return address, partially visible through the tear, showed only a county, Wiltshire. She left the sitting room as she had found it and went downstairs to find Dorothea. "Tell me about the early years," she said, settling next to Dorothea on the sofa in the manner of a woman preparing for a comfortable conversation. "You've all known one another such a long time. Were there others in the group, originally? It seems the sort of friendship that begins with a wider circle and contracts." Dorothea considered. "We met at college, most of us. Cecily, Marjorie and I, and Rupert was reading law nearby. Edmund Fleming came along through Rupert." She paused. "There was a girl called Eleanor Vane. She and Cecily were terribly close. Closer than any of us, really. But she left. After the 2nd year. There was some trouble. I never quite knew the details. And she simply went away, and we lost touch." "What sort of trouble?" Dorothea looked faintly uncomfortable. "I was never certain. Cecily didn't speak of it, and it felt wrong to ask. You know how some things are. They become closed subjects, and reopening them would be a form of rudeness." She paused. "I haven't thought about Eleanor in decades, truthfully. I wonder whatever happened to her." "I'm sure she made her way," said Miss Marple kindly. But she was thinking of a postmark from Wiltshire, and a torn envelope, and a photograph of 2 young women laughing in Whitstable in 1971. Chapter 5. The Secretary's Secret. The afternoon brought a thin, grey rain that discouraged the garden walk, and gathered everyone indoors in that slightly oppressive way that bad weather has in houses where something terrible has happened. The rooms, which had seemed pleasantly spacious the evening before, acquired a constricted quality, and the sound of other people moving through them, footsteps on the floor above, a door closing somewhere, the creak of the old heating, became oddly amplified. Miss Marple found Nora Blythe in the small room off the kitchen that served as an estate office. Filing cabinets, a computer, 2 telephones, the administrative skeleton of a busy household, and a thriving garden society. Her hands were flat on the surface, as if she were testing its solidity. "May I come in?" Miss Marple asked. Nora looked up. Of course. She gestured to the second chair, a utilitarian thing. "There's no reason to stand on ceremony today, I suppose." "There's never much reason to stand on ceremony," said Miss Marple, sitting down. "In my experience, ceremony is usually performed for the benefit of the person who insists upon it." She looked around the office with mild interest. "You manage everything, I understand." "The administration, yes." Mrs. Holt she was wonderful with people, and with the gardens. The paperwork she found rather less congenial. A ghost of something, affection, or its memory, moved across Nora's face. "How long had you worked for her?" 4 years. I came straight from university. I answered an advertisement. Nora's voice was level and careful. "It was only meant to be a temporary position, 6 months, to help reorganize the Garden Society's records. But then, I stayed. The work suited you, or the place." A pause. "Both. Mrs. Holt she was good to me." "The sort of goodness that makes loyalty natural," said Miss Marple. "One doesn't repay it in the ordinary sense. One simply finds oneself committed." Nora looked at her steadily. "Is this a conversation, Miss Marple, or an interview?" "It's both, I expect," said Miss Marple without apology. "I am an old woman who has seen a great deal, and I have found that conversations are almost always interviews of one kind or another. The question is whether both parties acknowledge it." She smiled. "You were awake during the night. The air in the small office shifted. I sometimes have trouble sleeping. You were in the drawing room before you came downstairs this morning. The ash on your shoe." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Then, I went down at about 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. I sometimes do that. Come downstairs, read for a while." The drawing room was the warmest room. She stopped. "Was Mrs. Holt alive at that point?" "Yes." The word came out quickly, as if it had been waiting. "She was in the chair, asleep. I thought she was asleep. The fire was very low but still going. I put another small log on. I didn't want her to wake up cold. And then I left." "You didn't wake her?" "She looked peaceful. I didn't want to disturb her." Nora's voice cracked slightly and steadied. I should have woken her and sent her to bed properly, if I had." "You could not have known," said Miss Marple. "And the log you placed on the fire, it burned out entirely by morning. So whatever happened to Mrs. Holt, it was after you left and before the fire died." Nora looked at her with an expression of something like relief, which Miss Marple found interesting. The relief of someone who has been carrying guilt about one specific thing and has just been told it isn't that thing. "Nora," said Miss Marple, with the gentleness of someone preparing to ask something difficult, "in your 4 years with Mrs. Holt, in all the correspondence, the administration, the management of her affairs, did you ever encounter anything that seemed to you irregular, financial or otherwise?" The silence was longer this time. Nora's hands pressed flat against the desk. "There was a payment," she said at last, "monthly, for the last 18 months, to a bank account I didn't recognize. It wasn't one of the society's accounts, or the household accounts. It came out of a private account Mrs. Holt managed herself. When I asked her about it, she said it was a personal matter, and asked me to leave the books as they were." She paused. "I did. It was not. It was a significant sum, several £100 each month. And you didn't question it further. She was my employer, and I trusted her judgment. I still do." Nora looked up. "Whatever that payment was, Miss Marple, it wasn't wrong. I know that. I knew her." "I don't doubt it," said Miss Marple. "Thank you, Nora." She left the estate office and stood for a moment in the passage, listening to the rain against the kitchen window. Several £100 a month, for 18 months, to an account she didn't recognize. A postmark from Wiltshire. A woman named Eleanor Vane, who had been Cecily's closest friend, and had then, following some unspecified trouble, simply vanished from the photographs and from the story. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, and of a woman named Agnes Poole, who had quietly sent money to her estranged sister for 15 years before the sister's death, and whom no one had known about it, because Agnes had understood that the giving was for Agnes's sake as much as the sister's, and that to speak of it would be to diminish it. Cecily Holt had been sending money to someone she owed something to. The question was whether that person had been grateful. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Twice-Told Story. At 4:30, Inspector Crane returned to the house with the information that the post-mortem had been expedited, and the preliminary results confirmed what Miss Marple's nose had already suggested. Cecily Holt had died from the ingestion of a cyanide compound, specifically potassium cyanide, consistent with a lethal dose administered in liquid, the cup of chamomile tea found on the table beside her. The house went very quiet. Inspector Crane gathered everyone in the drawing room, a deliberate choice, Miss Marple thought. He wanted them to feel the room's associations, and delivered this information with the flat, official calm that police training produces, and which manages to be more alarming than any dramatic delivery could achieve. "This is now a murder investigation," he said. "I would like to ask each of you again about last evening. Please consider your answers carefully." The recounts were largely consistent with the morning's versions, which suggested that people had been thinking about their versions all day and had, intentionally or otherwise, made them tighter. Rupert had retired at 11, Pamela at 11, sleeping tablet, heard nothing. Marjorie had gone up at 11:30, she now specified, half an hour later than the morning's account, which she attributed to forgetfulness. Dr. Fleming had been the last to leave the drawing room, at midnight, he said. Miss Marple had been knitting through all of this. She looked up at Dr. Fleming. "I thought," she said, pleasantly, and to no one in particular, "that you mentioned this morning you had retired at 11, Dr. Fleming. I may be mistaken. My memory is not what it was." Inspector Crane looked at his notes. He looked at Dr. Fleming. Dr. Fleming's expression underwent a subtle adjustment. "Did I say 11? I may have been imprecise. I stayed to have a final drink. It was near midnight when I went up." "So you were the last person in this room with Mrs. Holt," said Inspector Crane. "Apparently so. What was her state when you left?" "Alive, perfectly well. She had her tea, that herbal preparation she always drank in the evenings. We spoke for a few minutes. She said she intended to sit by the fire for a little while before going up. I said good night. What did you speak about?" A pause, the same pause Miss Marple had noted through the study door that morning. "Old times, nothing significant." "Specifically?" Inspector Crane pressed. Dr. Fleming looked at his hands. She said she was thinking of making some adjustments to her estate planning, that she felt there were unresolved matters she ought to address. He was choosing his words with the care of a man navigating a field he knows is dangerous. "I said it was wise to keep these things in order, that was all." "And you are mentioned in her will, Dr. Fleming?" "I believe I am, as is customary between old friends. A bequest, no more." "Did you know," said Inspector Crane, consulting a paper his sergeant had handed him sometime in the past few minutes, "that Mrs. Holt had recently seen her solicitor and was in the process of amending her will significantly? The appointment was 3 days ago." The room was very still. "I did not know that," said Dr. Fleming. His voice was level, but the word "not" had more weight in it than the sentence required. Miss Marple made a small sound that might have been assent, or might have been simply the noise of someone shifting in a chair, and returned to her knitting. She had noticed the thing she had been waiting to notice, which was not the inconsistency about the time, that was the obvious discrepancy, the one meant to be found, but rather the way Dr. Fleming had said that herbal preparation she always drank in the evenings. Always. He had her domestic routine as knowledge he did not need to qualify or speculate about. He simply knew it. That was the knowledge of someone with access to habits formed in private, over time, in ways that guest acquaintance did not explain. He had known which cup would be hers. Chapter 7. The Newcomer's Burden. That evening, dinner was a quieter and considerably less comfortable affair. The cook had produced something simple, a soup, bread, cold cuts, as though elaborate food would be a form of indecency. They ate mostly in silence. Rupert made 2 attempts at conversation that died without taking, and gave up. It was Pamela who spoke, eventually, with a composure that had the quality of something decided upon in advance. "I think," she said, addressing the table generally, "that we all ought to be honest with each other about what we know. There's clearly something some history, that several of you share, and that I am not party to, and I am sitting in this room as a suspect in the murder of a woman I barely knew, while whatever it is remains unspoken." Rupert said, "Pamela." "No." She put down her fork. "Rupert, I've been patient, and I've played the role you wanted me to play this weekend, which was to be present and agreeable, and not ask uncomfortable questions. But a woman is dead, and if there's something relevant that you know, then you should say it." The silence that followed was the silence of people who have been called accurately to account and are deciding how to respond. Marjorie spoke first. "There's nothing I know that the inspector doesn't know." "That," said Pamela, "is a very carefully worded sentence." Marjorie looked at her without apparent resentment. "It is. I was a solicitor for 30 years. Careful wording is habitual. And you've been her solicitor, haven't you?" Pamela pressed. "Not just her friend. You arranged the appointment 3 days ago." The table shifted. Rupert made a sound. Marjorie was still for a moment and then said, steadily, "I am not able to discuss the contents of client communications." "But you arranged the appointment," Pamela said. "And then this happens." "Pamela." Rupert's voice had lost its joviality entirely. It was a warning, but Miss Marple noticed it was also something else. It was fear, quite undisguised. Pamela looked at her husband for a long moment, and something in her expression, that practiced social warmth, dropped away entirely, and underneath it she looked tired and clear-sighted and rather young. "What are you frightened of, Rupert?" she said quietly. He did not answer. Miss Marple had been watching all of this with the expression of a woman following a play in a language she mostly but not entirely speaks. And now she said mildly, "I wonder whether anyone knows the terms of the existing will, the one Mrs. Holt was planning to amend." Marjorie Keel looked at her. "I don't ask you to breach any confidence," Miss Marple continued, "but the inspector knows, or will know shortly, and the information will not remain private for long, and it strikes me that several people in this room have spent today managing their knowledge very carefully, which is a form of effort that might be better directed elsewhere." Another silence. Then Marjorie said, to the wall just above Miss Marple's head, "In the existing will, the bulk of the estate is divided between charitable bequests and a number of personal legacies. Rupert Selby is named, Edmund Fleming is named. Nora Blythe receives a modest sum." She paused. "There is also a private specified bequest, held in trust through a separate instrument, in favor of a person named Eleanor Vane." Rupert's wineglass hit the table with a sound that was not quite a slam. "Marjorie," he said, "you had no right." "I have every right," said Marjorie, and her voice was very quiet and very clear. "Cecily is dead, Rupert. Eleanor Vane exists whether you say her name or not, and I have sat in rooms with secrets long enough." She rose from the table and left. No one spoke for a long time. Miss Marple looked at her hands and thought about a woman named Eleanor Vane, and monthly payments to an account in Wiltshire, and what trouble, 30-some years ago, could divide two close friends so completely that one of them had to become a secret, the other kept for the rest of her life. Chapter 8. The Garden in the Rain. Morning brought a lightening of the sky and a cessation of rain that felt, given the circumstances, faintly indecent in its cheerfulness. Miss Marple rose early, dressed, and walked in Cecily's garden before the others came down. It was, as Dorothea had promised, splendid. Even in October, even with the beds cleared and the lawns damp, the shape of it was beautiful. The proportions of the paths, the placement of the specimen trees, the long herbaceous border reduced to its winter structure of dried seed heads and artfully placed stone. Cecily Holt had made something here that had permanence and considered form, the garden of a person who thought in terms of decades. Miss Marple walked slowly and thought. She thought about the pattern of a friendship that had lasted 40 years and contained, within it, a wound that had never properly closed, because wounds of that kind do not close. They simply become incorporated. The friendship grows around the wound, the way a tree grows around a nail, and to an outside observer, the tree appears whole, and only when you look very closely at the grain of the wood do you see the distortion. She thought about a girl named Eleanor Vane, who had left a group of friends in some unspecified disgrace, 30-odd years ago, and to whom Cecily had been quietly sending money for the past 18 months, which meant, presumably, that they had been in contact again after a long silence. Something had prompted the renewed connection. Something had changed. She thought about Dr. Fleming, who had been the last person in the drawing room with Cecily, who had known her domestic habits with the familiarity of someone who spent time in a house as more than a guest, and who had, the previous evening, described a woman alive and composed and settled in her chair, and who had changed the time of his departure between one account and the next. And she thought about Rupert Selby, whose fear at the name Eleanor Vane had been entirely unguarded, and who had spent the weekend performing a joviality that was clearly a great deal of effort. She was about to turn back toward the house when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her, and found, with mild surprise, that it was Rupert himself, coatless despite the October air, his florid face creased and older-looking in the morning light than it had been the night before. "You're up early," he said. "I sleep less as I get older," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "It leaves more time for the day. Walk with me if you like." He fell into step beside her with the resignation of a man who has decided that a conversation is preferable to its avoidance. "You knew Eleanor Vane," said Miss Marple. A pause. "I knew her." "Yes. And whatever happened between her and your group, you were involved in it." Another pause. The gravel crunched under their feet. "She left," said Rupert. That's the simplest account. It's complicated to explain. Complicated things generally have simple causes," said Miss Marple. "In my experience." He was quiet for a moment. They reached the end of the border path and turned without discussion. She was not an easy person. She was brilliant, but unstable. She had problems. With money, principally. She borrowed from people. From all of us, really. Small sums at first. And then, he stopped. There was a sum of money that went missing from the Garden Society accounts. We were all involved in it, even at that age. It was a university horticultural society of all things, but Cecily ran it with complete seriousness, and there was a significant fundraising sum involved. He paused. The money was found to be missing. Eleanor was treasurer. "And she was blamed," said Miss Marple. "She was guilty," said Rupert. "We all knew it. She didn't deny it, not exactly. She left before any formal proceedings. She simply vanished." He breathed out. It was the right outcome, in a way. No charges, no scandal. It was easier. For whom? He looked at her. "For Eleanor," she said, "or for the rest of you. Who did the taking protect?" He said nothing, but his expression, in the cool October morning, told Miss Marple a considerable amount. It told her that the simple account was not quite the simple account. And it told her that somewhere in the distance between Eleanor was guilty and it was easier, there was the real story, the one that had cost Cecily Holt 30 years of private payments and one late-night appointment with her solicitor. "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that you had better tell Inspector Crane everything you have told me, and perhaps a little more that you haven't." Chapter 9. The Trap is Laid. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had spoken to Inspector Crane privately for 20 minutes in the estate office, and Inspector Crane had, by the end of those 20 minutes, the expression of a man who has been shown the pattern in a carpet he had been standing on all day. "You're certain," he said. "No," said Miss Marple. "I am never certain. I am only ever convinced, and I am very nearly convinced. You will need to confirm one thing, which I believe your colleagues can do today, with a telephone call to a solicitor in Wiltshire. And the trap? I think it needs to be this evening," she said. "The longer we wait, the more time there is for arrangements to be made. People who feel themselves closing in have a tendency to act, and not always predictably." She paused. "I would like to conduct the conversation myself, if you'll permit it. With you and your sergeant present, obviously. I simply think the matter is of a personal nature. There are dimensions to it that a formal interrogation might not reach." Inspector Crane looked at her steadily. "I've worked with some unusual approaches over the years," he said. "I'm sure you have," said Miss Marple. "I am simply an old woman who has known a great many people in a great many villages, and I have found that the most important things people say, they say to other people who appear harmless." She smiled. "It is my primary professional qualification." That afternoon, she sought out Edmund Fleming. He was in the sitting room, reading, or maintaining the attitude of reading, with the book at the correct angle, and his eyes in the correct position, and no actual comprehension passing from the page to his mind. which Miss Marple could tell because he had not turned a page in 20 minutes. "Dr. Fleming," she said, taking the chair beside him, "I wonder whether I might ask you something personal." He lowered the book. "I suppose I can't prevent you. You've been Cecily's doctor for 8 years, she said, and you've been her friend for considerably longer, 40 years, I believe, thereabouts, and a friend of Eleanor Vane's." He was very still. Then, with the careful control of a man who has spent decades maintaining surfaces, "Eleanor and I knew each other, yes, as I knew all of them." "Were you aware," said Miss Marple, "that Cecily had been in contact with Eleanor again these past 2 years, monthly payments, and recently a letter?" "I wasn't aware of the payments." This had the quality of a technical truth, accurate in its specifics, evasive in its implications. "But you knew Eleanor had been in contact." He set the book down. "What is it you're asking me, Miss Marple?" "I'm asking," she said gently, "whether you knew that Cecily was planning to amend her will to provide substantially for Eleanor Vane, to, in effect, acknowledge publicly what had been managed privately for so long. And I'm asking whether that information, the prospect of that acknowledgement, caused you difficulty." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the garden was going quiet in the late afternoon. "It would have caused considerable difficulty," he said at last. "Not for me, for Rupert." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I rather thought so." She left him then, left him to consider what he had just said, and what it meant that he had said it, and to reach the conclusion she needed him to reach before this evening. She went to find Nora Blythe, who was the person she was, in the end, most concerned about. Not as a suspect, but as a witness, a keeper of documents, a person who had been present in the house for 4 years, and whose particular, careful loyalty would be an asset in what was about to happen. "I need you to do something for me tonight," Miss Marple said. "It will be simple, and it will not require you to do anything against your conscience. But I need you to be in the drawing room at 8 o'clock, and I need you to bring the household accounts ledger, the last 18 months. Nora looked at her. "You know," she said, "I know enough. Tonight will settle the rest." At 7, Inspector Crane received a telephone call from his sergeant, who had been in contact with a solicitor's office in Marlborough, Wiltshire. He came to find Miss Marple immediately, and she listened to what he had learned, with the expression of someone who has been expecting a thing, and is still, despite themselves, moved by its confirmation. "The solicitor confirms," he said, "that a woman named Eleanor Vane died in Marlborough General Hospital 9 days ago. Natural causes. She had been ill for some months." He paused. "The payments would have ceased on her death. The letter, the one with the Wiltshire postmark, was likely notification from the solicitor handling her estate." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is what I thought." "Which means that whoever killed Cecily Holt did so in the belief that the amended will was still necessary, that Eleanor Vane was still alive and still a threat to the arrangement that has kept a certain secret for 30 years. "They didn't know she was dead," said Inspector Crane. "They knew Cecily had seen her solicitor. They knew about the proposed amendment, but they did not know that Eleanor Vane had died before the will could be changed." She paused. The motive existed, based on an event that had already been overtaken. The murder was committed for nothing, which is, in my experience, precisely the kind of mistake that reveals a murderer, because the murder was not committed for greed or gain or protection. It was committed out of panic, and panic is not a careful state. At 8 o'clock, she was in the drawing room. Chapter 10. The Fire is Named. The drawing room at Thornfield Grange had been set, that evening, as a kind of stage, without any theatrical intention beyond the circumstantial one. The fire was lit. It burned well, the wood dry, the sound of it a low, continuous presence beneath conversation. The curtains were drawn, the chairs had been arranged, without anyone quite deciding to arrange them, into a configuration that faced inward, that gathered. Inspector Crane was present, and his sergeant, and all the guests. Nora Blythe sat to one side with the ledger closed on her knees. Dorothea had the bewildered, anxious expression of a person who knows something decisive is about to happen, and is not at all sure they are prepared. Miss Marple sat nearest the fire. She had her knitting, though she did not use it. "I want to speak about Eleanor Vane," she said. The room went still. "Not because she is a suspect. She died 9 days ago, in a hospital in Wiltshire, which Inspector Crane has confirmed, but because she is, in a sense, the centre of this. The answer to why Cecily died is the answer to what Eleanor Vane was to this group, and what her existence threatened. Rupert said, "Miss Marple, I really don't think—" "Mr. Selby," said Inspector Crane. "Please," Miss Marple continued. 40 years ago, money went missing from a university society account. Eleanor Vane was treasurer and was blamed. She left. No charges were brought. The matter was, as someone said to me recently, made easier." She paused. "What I believe happened, and what I believe Cecily Holt spent the last 30 years knowing, is that Eleanor Vane did not take that money, or did not take all of it, or was encouraged to take the blame for something that was at least partly someone else's responsibility." Rupert's face was dark red. "Rupert needed money," said Miss Marple. "He was young and careless, and the debt was pressing. Eleanor was vulnerable. She had already borrowed from friends, her reputation was compromised, and her word against Rupert's would not have stood. Cecily knew this, because Cecily trusted Eleanor, and Cecily was perceptive. The arrangement was not made explicit, these things never are. Eleanor was given to understand that leaving would be simpler than staying, and she left. This is," Rupert stood, "this is speculation. Cecily was sending Eleanor money," said Miss Marple, "for 18 months, from a private account. That is not speculation. Nora has the records. Cecily had recently renewed contact with Eleanor. I believe Eleanor was ill, and reached out, and Cecily, who had never made peace with what happened, responded with money, because money was the shape her guilt had been given." She paused. "And she had gone to her solicitor, 3 days before she died, to amend her will, to leave Eleanor a proper provision, not a secret monthly payment, but an acknowledged legacy, the kind that creates a record, the kind that would raise questions, after Cecily's death, about why Eleanor Vane was named." "Questions," said Dr. Fleming quietly from his chair. "Questions about a 30-year-old arrangement, about why a woman who had ostensibly stolen from a university society was being provided for by one of the people who had driven her out, about what Cecily knew that made that provision feel necessary." She looked at Rupert. Questions that Rupert Selby could not afford to have asked. "I didn't kill her," said Rupert. His voice had changed entirely. The joviality gone, the performance abandoned, what remained underneath, unexpectedly raw. "I didn't kill her. I need you to understand that." "I do understand that," said Miss Marple. "I don't believe you did." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of held breath. Miss Marple turned. "Pamela," she said. Pamela Selby had not moved from her chair. She was sitting very straight, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed with the absolute surface control of a woman who has been managing impressions for a very long time. But her eyes had the look of a person who has been waiting for a door to open and is watching it swing. "You discovered it," said Miss Marple. "Not recently. I think some time ago. You are not a woman who misses things, and you've been married to Rupert for 12 years? You would have noticed the anxiety that surfaced whenever certain subjects arose. You are, I think, a woman who researches, who is thorough." She paused. "You knew about Eleanor. You had probably known for a long time, and when you discovered that Cecily had been to her solicitor, and you discovered this because you checked Cecily's correspondence before we arrived, having come early to help with the arrangements, which Rupert said you did, you understood what an amended will would mean." "Pamela." Rupert's voice was barely audible. "You were protecting him," said Miss Marple. "That's the shape of it. You've spent 12 years protecting him, from himself, from his past, from the consequences of a thing he did in his 20s. You've become very skilled at it. And when you saw the threat approaching, the solicitor's appointment, the will, the public acknowledgement that would unravel everything, you didn't hesitate." She paused. "Cecily always had chamomile tea in the evenings. You had been in the house before. You knew her habits, as anyone who had visited did. And potassium cyanide is not an impossible thing to obtain for someone who is determined and has some preparation time, and you had 3 days, from the appointment to the weekend." The fire crackled. "She would have destroyed us," said Pamela. Her voice was perfectly even. "Not Cecily. Cecily was gone. Cecily would have just changed a will. But the questions afterward, the inquiry, Rupert's name dragged through, everything we've built." She stopped. "He was 22. He made a mistake. People make mistakes. Eleanor Vane's entire adult life was shaped by that mistake," said Miss Marple. She had 30 years of consequences. She was paid. She was silenced, said Miss Marple. There is a difference. Pamela looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her husband, not with desperation, but with a terrible, composed clarity, and said, I didn't intend for you to know. I know, said Rupert. His voice had the sound of a man on whom something very heavy has come to rest. Inspector Crane rose. Mrs. Selby, he said. Pamela stood. She smoothed her skirt, which was an automatic gesture, the gesture of a woman maintaining form past the last moment when it is possible. She looked at Miss Marple. How? She said. It was a professional question, asked without anger. You told me yourself, said Miss Marple, or very nearly. The protective impulse. You've made an art form of it. When you said Rupert had taken a sleeping tablet, you, not he. You had established it beforehand. He couldn't have done it because he was asleep, but no one had yet suggested he might have done it. The protection came before the accusation. She paused. And the name Eleanor Vane. When Marjorie said it at dinner, Rupert was shocked, genuinely. The name surfaced something he'd buried. But you, Pamela, you arranged your face a fraction of a second too late. You'd heard it before. You'd been expecting it. Pamela considered this. Then she nodded, once, and allowed Inspector Crane to take her from the room. The fire burned on. No one spoke for a long time. Rupert Selby sat with his hands on his knees and his face turned toward the cold grate, and Miss Marple, looking at him, thought that the weight he was carrying now, the weight of what he had done at 22, and what that doing had set in motion over 40 years, arriving at last here, in this room, on this particular evening, was a weight he would carry for whatever remained of his life. She did not feel sorry for him precisely, but she felt something. Dr. Fleming said quietly to the room. She would have destroyed them, you know. Not deliberately. Cecily never did anything deliberately destructive, but she had decided to be honest at last, and honesty, when it comes late, is a form of demolition. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think Cecily knew that. I think it was why she had waited so long. And I think what changed, finally, was Eleanor's illness. The knowledge that Eleanor was dying, and that whatever Cecily did would now be for the record, rather than for Eleanor's actual use. She paused. She wanted it to mean something. She wanted to say, in writing, where it could be seen, this woman was wronged, and I knew it, and I am sorry. And it cost her everything, said Marjorie, from the corner, in a low voice. Honesty often does, said Miss Marple. That is why people so rarely commit to it in time. She rose, set her knitting aside, and went to stand before the fire. It was burning well, the same draught, the same good dry wood as the night Cecily had sat in this room and watched it die down. The same room, a different night. Outside, the beeches were quiet. The wind had dropped. Miss Marple stood by the fire for a long time and thought about Eleanor Vane, who would never know that her name had been said aloud in this room, and that the woman who had loved her best had tried, at the end, to set things right, and had paid for the attempt with her life. It was not a comfortable thought. But then, truth rarely is. That, Miss Marple had always found, was precisely how you could tell it was the truth. The fire burned down through the night, and by morning the Grange was quiet and cold, and the October light, coming through the long windows, lay across the empty chairs and the cold hearth, and the place where Cecily Holt had sat for the last time, peaceful, settled, watching the flames, not yet knowing, in those final moments, that the friendship she had spent 30 years trying to honor had already become the thing that ended her. Miss Marple collected her knitting, thanked Inspector Crane, and allowed Dorothea to drive her home through the stripped beech woodland in the grey Monday morning, and said nothing at all on the drive back, which Dorothea, to her credit, understood and respected. Some silences are not comfortable, but they are honest, and that, in the end, is the best that can be asked of any of us.